Welcome everyone. My name is Niki Harman and I'm the film programmer here at Nottingham Contemporary. I'm joined by Professor Kevin Liu from the University of Essex, who is the head of Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies. Do you want to say a little bit about your focus?
Yeah, hi Nikki. Hi everyone. Thanks for the invite. Really pleased to be here. Yeah, so in terms of my research interests, my main area of expertise is analytical psychology. So the psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, which also includes post-Jungian theory. So extensions of Jungian theory in the context of more contemporary debates and disciplinary boundaries. In terms of my own work, I've done quite a bit with the application of Jungian ideas to the discipline of history. I've written critiques on some post-Jungian theories, including the theory of cultural complexes. Really interested in film, popular culture, so I have a few papers on that. Really interested in graphic novels and also issues of race and racial hybridity.
Okay, great. That sounds awesome. Cultural complexes. I don't think I've come across that, so it would be great if you if you can let us know a little bit about that as we go on.
Sure.
Um, I'm I don't have a background in psychology. I just have like a really avid interest in psychoanalysis. Um, so to start off, this season of the Screener Contemporary is inspired by our current exhibition, Hollow Earth, which is art caves and the subterranean imaginary. And we've taken kind of that theme and it's called the film program is called Into the Shadows. And we've borrowed from the idea of Carl Jung of the personal shadow. So kind of what looms dark or what remains repressed within us individually or collectively, and are
Sure.
exploring that in 100 years of film. So starting from Jordan Peele's Us through to F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. Um, so the quote that I had in my mind when I was programming this was that which remains unknown will appear to us as fate. And that was the kind of Jung quote that I had that I was kind of drawing from every time I chose a film. Could you tell us a little bit about Carl Jung, give us some context of him, but also what he meant by the shadow?
Sure, absolutely. I think you've provided a really great definition for us to begin this exploration of the shadow. Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and also psychoanalyst, um, probably best known as a one-time disciple of Sigmund Freud, but someone who actually carved out his own path, broke from the psychoanalytic movement, and created, I guess, his own brand of his approach to the talking therapies, which we know as analytical psychology. Although at one point there was a real desire to name his psychology complex psychology. So it
Okay.
shows how important the idea of the complex and how central it is actually to the development of his ideas.
Mm.
Um, he's really known for bringing a lot of psychological ideas into the mainstream. So as you mentioned, we have ideas like the shadow, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, synchronicity, all this stems from Jung. But even if you look to introversion and extroversion, well,
Mm.
that's actually Carl Jung when he was thinking and devising psychological types, which was really his response to try to understand why different psychoanalysts like himself, Freud, and Alfred Adler could look at the same case,
Hmm.
but approach it in such diverse ways.
Mm.
And our listeners and your audience will know that Jung's theory of psychological types becomes the springboard or the foundation for the Myers-Briggs type indicator.
Yeah.
And Jung was also the one who stated that there was an extension to the word association test, which
Hmm.
then actually becomes the lie detector test. So he
Oh,
said
really? Okay.
there's a further application
Mm.
to this particular idea, but by that time he was so entrenched in mythology, so
Mm.
entrenched in his own therapeutic work that he moved away from what many might consider his focus on, let's say, the psychology of consciousness, and then
Mhm.
really diving into psychology of the unconscious. So really, Jung is a pioneer. A lot of his ideas find expression in the mainstream today, but also a lot of his ways of working and practicing therapeutically. So the fact that most therapists, not all, but most therapists sit across from their client or their analysand, well,
Hmm.
that's a Jungian innovation because Jung wanted people to meet in the middle ground as equals and to realize and to trust that both individuals in this interaction are transformed together in this space. So there's a
Hmm.
sense of that equality and the co-creation of knowledge within that space.
So yeah, because I suppose the Freudian model, that I suppose Lacan kind of continued is that you're not looking at your analyst, right? That you're looking away.
Sure.
And then didn't Jung call you just remind I completely forgot about this, but didn't Jung call it an alchemic bath? Or like there's an alchemic process between analyst and analysand.
Yeah.
Um, because I really feel that there's a process of audience, like
Mhm.
the film and audience. I feel like there's an alchemic process that
Yeah.
happens when we watch a film. And I think that's why Jung and his work with like kind of archetypes as well is like is such a like how do I put this? Is so great to look at films through kind of his gaze
Yeah.
and through his kind of theories because they're so they just well all psychoanalysis but especially Jungian and cinema theory has like you know a really good kind of bedfellows and a
Sure.
lot of film theory is influenced by and dictated by psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory.
Yeah.
But
No.
oh, sorry, go
Yeah. No.
on.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree. And my colleague, Professor Luke Hockley,
Mhm.
has a lot of ideas about the interaction between the audience and that which is viewed, and the third space of transformation, if you will,
Ah,
taking from
okay.
ideas of what happens in that particular process. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And there are so many, if you will, ways that we can look at that interaction and why we're so moved by films from psychodynamic and psychoanalytic points of view. So if you think about the transaction that we're entering,
Hmm.
right? In the good old days when we still buy tickets, and I'm hoping people are buying tickets to the viewings
Yeah.
that you're holding in person, there is an agreement
Mm.
that for these 2 hours, for these 90 minutes, however long it is, that we are going to suspend judgment, we're going to suspend reality, and we're going into this setting, allowing ourselves and opening ourselves to the possibility of being transformed through that
Mm.
interaction with what is actually on the screen.
Yeah.
Um, there's a boundaried space, right? The theater or the cinema itself, it's time limited, and then there's a
Mhm.
return to reality. So in that ways, it shares many similarities with therapy itself. Not to
Yeah.
say that therapy, but there are therapeutic resonances and
Hmm.
therapeutic means of understanding that interaction and that connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there definitely is. And that is like it also holds it in reverence too. So all because we at the screen we have it's all rep cinema. So it's all films that have been out at the very least a couple of years. So people could see it at home. All the films that we show they could see at home. Um, but having it on the screen and having it within a kind of darkened room with other people, it holds film in reverence. And I suppose there's a reverence with the analyst and analysand and that kind of interaction, right? Because it's not just a chat with a mate.
Sure,
It's
sure.
like a sacred both of you know, I don't think I'm being dramatic when I say both of which are somewhat of a like sacred space.
Mm,
But as you said, transformation. So if I could pull it back into the shadow,
yeah, absolutely.
specifically, like what's your kind of explanation of Jung's theory of the shadow?
Sure. So the way I teach or try to convey what Jung meant by the shadow is just to ask everyone first and foremost, what do you hate in other people? So if we were in a room together and it was a classroom setting, sorry, I can't break free from that. A bit
You just
about persona here, which we can touch on as well. And we just start listing, well, what do we actually hate in other people? We hate people who are deceptive, duplicitous, people who are late, whatever it is, we start writing that down. And once we have that list, what I ask students to consider is to actually take that back, to take that projection back. Because ultimately for Jung, what we actually dislike in other people may be elements within ourselves that we
Right.
dislike. So that duplicitousness, that, deceptiveness, it's not out there in the world. We actually have to take it back and maybe consider, well, I'm actually also capable of these ways of being, these ways of acting that I find deplorable in other people.
Hmm.
So you could say that the shadow, for the most part, denotes the darker side of the personality. So things that we don't want to come to light, things that we don't acknowledge within ourselves. But equally, I think it's important to emphasize that for Jung, shadow can also have perhaps a more neutral and positive aspect as well.
Okay.
And just to note that anything that has yet come to consciousness. So if we think about it another way, and I think there's a great example actually at the end of Blue Velvet, if we see the growth of an individual at
Hmm.
a particular moment in time, and I see a lot of students at a very crucial moment in terms of entering university. Now, at that moment, at least according to Jung, what they have the potential to become, it's already in them. It's a seed, if you will, that's
Hmm.
growing, just waiting to come forth. But that only lies in potential. And it's really up to that person to kind of activate that potential, to hear the call, to nurture it, etc. But
Hmm.
at that moment, what they are capable of becoming is actually unconscious. It's potentially unknown. And therefore, you could say it's in shadow. So it's not necessarily always denoting the negative side of the
Hmm.
personality. It's that which is yet to make its way, if you will, into consciousness.
And did you say something about we're all born with a diamond and we forget what it is, and so we have to kind of fig our whole life's work is to figure out what it is, what our calling is.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of Jung's ideas on the development of the personality, which is encapsulated in this idea of individuation,
Mm.
and the archetypal self is this kind of penultimate image, if you will, of that which we could become. And in that image of the self are both kind of the positive and negative aspects. So for Jung, the ultimate goal is wholeness, not perfection. It means
Hmm.
making friends with your shadow and learning to live with the shadow and in a relationship with it. But for Jung, development is both linear and cyclical. So
Hmm.
it's linear in the sense that there's something, this ideal, that's actually driving the path of individuation. So driving the telos, the movement, the trajectory forward, if you will.
Hmm.
But it's cyclical in the sense that we meet these archetypal imperatives, these images that we project onto other people, aspects of ourselves. We constantly meet them throughout our life. But it's not the case that, let's say, you meet the shadow and then, well, I've dealt with that now. Time to move on to the
I'm
next archetype.
healed.
Yeah, it's constant. So we meet the shadow in one guise, and then
Mm.
we rotate and we meet the shadow again in a
Mm.
different guise. But
Mm.
I think the element to emphasize is that every time we meet the shadow again, we meet it from a higher position. We meet it from a higher level of consciousness, which
Okay.
allows us to integrate the different aspects of the shadow as we move throughout the life cycle.
I haven't heard it said like that before. That's really interesting. You mentioned the end of Blue Velvet, or there's so I know you said at the beginning of the Zoom that I've like led you down a rabbit hole. So let's go down it. What scene, which part did you mean?
The Robin, the Robin.
Okay, I had that written down as well. Yeah, go ahead. Like what?
So, I mean, it's a really interesting film, and like I said to you, I couldn't help but make comparisons to Mulholland Drive,
Yeah.
and even to a certain extent to Twin Peaks, because there's a lot of similarities, a lot of thematic resonance that's kind of occurring throughout these various pieces of Lynch's work.
Mm.
It's a story of two halves. You have the daylight world, and you have nighttime. You have wholesome Jeffrey Beaumont, who stands in conflict or in exploration of these two aspects of himself that are manifested or represented by what classical Jungians would call these anima figures. So
Right.
you have Sandy, representing the consciousness, the daylight world, and then you have Dorothy Valens as this representation of that kind of darker aspect. And I think what's really intriguing and interesting is that everything is set as a mystery. And I think that's really fitting because they're both him and Sandy, sorry, Jeffrey Beaumont and Sandy are trying
Mm-hmm.
to intervene and try to find ways into this darker world,
Mm-hmm.
right? To kind of intersect with it, to kind of delve further into it. But
Mm.
once he begins to unravel that mystery of himself, and I think this is really about a mystery of who he is, he begins to see that, well, those aspects lurking in the unconscious, those aspects of his personality that he hasn't completely dealt with, they're not peaceful figures. They're not benevolent figures. So he meets Frank, he meets gangsters, he meets aggression, unbridled sexuality, aggression. And what I think he's beginning to realize throughout the film is that there's a bit of Beaumont in Frank and a bit of Frank in Beaumont.
Yeah, for sure. And doesn't he say, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, please go ahead. Yeah,
Okay. There's at some point he says, I'm seeing something that was always hidden. And that's exactly it, right? Like he's seeing his shadow.
sure, sure, absolutely. I mean, when he's making love to Dorothy and actually gives in to that kind of violent aggression,
Hmm.
you know, the very uncomfortable scene with Frank as well, you're beginning to see those fantasies merging into one. So
Mm.
what he's viewing through the closet is actually an aspect of himself.
Yeah, and there's a cinematic element to that too, isn't it? It's like, and Frank's character is so, and Dorothy's actually, they're so hypothetical, almost hyper, like characters from a fairy tale. That it is like almost imagined characters for these two kind of suburban kind of uh young people to, I suppose, individuate. But I really love it. And Lynch is so good at this as well. That kind of light and dark, as you say, the kind of suburban apple pie with the kind of dark, seedy underbelly, how he kind of positions that as two sides of the same coin. And I think anyone that kind of really interrogates that kind of Americana in that way does that really well.
Yeah, and what I found interesting as well along those lines is that initially Jeffrey is kind of censoring everything to Sandy,
Mm,
so he's not telling the full story of the full picture of his investigations and actions during the nighttime world. And what I love as well, he's wearing a suit actually, or
mm,
what was considered quote unquote fancy dress as he's delving into this nighttime world now, at least psychologically, there's a few things happening. Everything's happening in dream, and this is where I couldn't help but make comparisons to Mulholland Drive.
okay,
So
go
the
on.
fact that Ben is asked by Frank to lip sync in dreams by I think it was Roy Orbison.
Yeah.
It almost kind of sets the scene that everything is happening in the dream world,
Hmm.
the interaction with that shadow element.
Hmm.
Um, Now, psychologically, are we allowed to give spoilers?
I mean, I think most people coming have been,
Sure,
we can say at the beginning maybe that there are spoilers. I think a lot of people who have
sure.
already seen it. So yeah, go on.
So I'll try to frame it in such a way that's perhaps judicious, but the interaction, the penultimate scene um, between Frank and Jeffrey Beaumont, psychologically, it's more about the relationship that we build with that shadow element rather than ridding ourselves of that element. So I found it actually really helpful to see that last scene. So you have this kind of gloss of what life looks like. Yeah, acceptance of a shadow or beginning to live in relationship with a shadow and to realize that, again, the goal is to reach a more holistic understanding of oneself rather than perfection. So
Mm.
you remember throughout the film, the robin, I think Sandy said it's a representation or symbol of love. And it really kind of almost encapsulates her innocence, her naivete to a certain extent. But
Mm,
right at the end, the robin's actually eating a bug, and it's struggling. And
mm,
that's the reality of it. That as much as you may want to have this persona or this gloss, if you will, of the white picket fences, the colorful roses and flowers, and
mm,
Jeffrey's father's okay, all is forgiven in terms
mm,
of Jeffrey's own transgressions, which are revealed.
mm,
The night that Dorothy ends up at his house, and then they take her over to Sandy's. So
yeah,
all these kind of elements are kind of forgotten, and it's this kind of perfect story at the end, the storybook ending. But then you see the Robin eating the insect, which almost breaks that vision, if you will.
that perfection. Yeah, and she says, doesn't she, about a dream, and says it's like nothing but pure kind of light and love. And that's what Jung says, right? The kind of um the more the darkness is forgotten, the blacker and denser it becomes. And like that darkness is part of him, right? And it's that is how he can be and how we can all be whole. I think Jung said something about I'd rather be whole than good or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like when you mentioned him talking to Sandy and withholding some of the information that we know has happened, that again kind of reminds me not to keep bringing everything back to an analyst's couch, but that is kind of like that, right? Because when you're trying to figure out the truth of who you are, or people try and figure out what their reality is, um, no one actually knows what their reality is or what their truth is. And so when they are on the analyst couch, sometimes they make things up. Like I think Zizek, the Lacan, no, the is he Lacanian? I don't know. He's Lacanian. Has like admitted to just making stuff up in analysis. Um, so really interesting. And Jeffrey almost didn't seem like he knew that he was leaving information out.
Yeah, no, no, it's very interesting. Um, Again, for me, that whole film is in dream, so it's almost kind of
Hmm.
blurring the boundary of what's reality and what's actually happening in, if you will, a dream sequence. And I think Lynch does this so well.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, with Mulholland Drive, I think for me the key moment, I think it was called the vision of Silencio or the illusion of Silencio, and
Okay.
that ushered in this kind of shift between the perfection, the search for Hollywood that Betty's going through in the first half,
Mhm.
until you get to the reality of her situation
Mhm.
in the second half.
Yeah. And Lost Highway as well. I think that's my favorite Lynch film. I just love that film so much. And I like David Lynch. I don't love him. Like I'm not, um, I don't have the same intense love that a lot of people do. But yeah, he does that really well. And I think like film theorists in the 1920s and surrealists were so excited about film because they said this is the perfect medium, almost the best medium to articulate our dreams. And yeah, I think filmmakers that can still do that now, you are kind of elevated into a different space. Speaking of filmmakers and dreams, I was thinking about all the filmmakers within the season and thinking about how you can see their shadow within it, with,
Sure.
you know, um, and how even if the filmmaker says, this is my intention with this, or this is what I meant by this scene, they can only know so much because them making a film is like a dream, and I was reading do you know Robert Ebert, who was a really
Oh yeah.
yeah film critic from the
Yeah,
Chicago
yeah.
Sun
Cisco and
Times?
Ebert. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. He kind of like criticized this, and he said something about it contains scenes of raw emotional energy that is easy to understand why some critics have held it as a masterpiece. A film that's painful and wounding and has to be given special consideration. And yet those very scenes of stark sexual despair are the tip off to what's wrong with the movie. They're so I like, and I definitely felt this. And when I read it, I was like, this is exactly how I feel. They're so
Mhm.
strong that they deserve to be in the movie that is sincere, honest, and true. I don't totally agree with that. But Blue Velvet surrounds them with a story that's marred by sophomoric satire and cheap shots.
Mhm.
The director is either denying the strength of the material or trying to diffuse it by pretending it's all part of a campy in joke. And there is this weird, and he like, and with Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway, he's matured, but there is something, yeah, sophomoric
Mhm.
about the way he kind of handles the darker side. And that I feel like reveals Lynch's shadow to us in a
Yeah,
way. You know what I
it's
mean?
very, yeah, no, absolutely. And I think authorial intention, or trying to recover the artist's, artist's intention, is an important aspect of it.
Hmm.
Um, Jung would criticize Freud for this, that
Okay.
um, Freud's approach to art and to interpreting art is basically psychobiography. So the neuroses, if you will, of the artist is then on display in the artwork itself.
Hmm.
Whereas Jung was really focusing on, well, yes, there's that, but then there's the afterlife of the art as well. That
Okay.
the way we interact with it gives it a life of its own. So,
Right.
once the author or the artist creates it, it almost is not theirs anymore. It belongs to
Yeah.
society, how we interact, how we interpret that. And your interpretation will be very different from mine, and so on and
Yeah.
so forth. So I
Mm.
think authorial intention is definitely one way we can
Mm.
access it. So we could be seeing shadow elements of the author. I think it's a really important aspect to delve into. But
Mm.
equally, that social commentary that they're providing can be showing us shadow elements within the culture itself. So
Mm.
example is Parasite. What are we not looking at in South Korea? This beautiful, magnificent life that the upper class lead, and what do you have? At the bottom of it, just, oh my goodness, economic inequality.
Yeah.
People completely struggling, et cetera, housing
Mm.
crises. You get that sense of urgency in other films and series as well, like Squid Game.
I haven't seen that yet.
So I think there's something about the authorial intention and what it shows about the individual artist, but also the commentary that they're providing on society. Because for
Sure.
Jung, the value of the artist is that he, she, they are able to delve into the unconscious. But
Hmm.
because of the particular skill set that they have, whatever they've done to perfect that ego strength, that container, whether it's film, whether it's sculpting, whether it's dance, whether it's music, etc. All those hours of practicing your craft and
Mm.
knowing the of your craft gives you that strong enough ego to delve into the unconscious, to not be overwhelmed by it, to take that which society doesn't know about. What is it not looking at? What is that shadow element? And to bring it back to the surface and to put it on display for the rest of society and say, this is what we're actually missing. And I
Mhm.
think for Jung, that's um, the burden that's placed on artists, but also their kind of own unique gift. And for him, that's why so many artists aren't respected during their lifetime, because ultimately what they pull out of the unconscious holds up a mirror to society. And if they're not ready to look at it, or if the way in which the artist is conveying that message isn't in tune with the rest of society, then they'll be looked over. But it's only years later,
Mhm.
perhaps after the artist has passed away, that you begin to realize the potential genius that was there.
Mm. And this actually brings us to Nosferatu, really, because I guess is this linked to collective unconscious? Because I suppose collective unconscious was a more Jungian idea than Freud, right? That talks about personal conscious, our our personal unconscious, and then so then Jung brought it to our collective unconscious. So is that how they would have the kind of difference of opinion when it comes to art and artists?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, with the difference between the personal and collective unconscious, I mean, when Freud revised his introductory lectures, he comes very close to postulating something very close to the collective unconscious. So
Right.
it's idea I think that was in the air, but perhaps because Jung had created that space for himself, there was a
Hmm.
reluctance to go there.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, many people would say, perhaps incorrectly and unfairly to Freud,
Hmm.
that his notion of the unconscious only went so far as
Okay.
Jung's personal unconscious. So the
Hmm.
unconscious made up of repressed and suppressed material accumulated throughout one's lifetime. For Jung, he goes a level deeper and say not only do we have that personal unconscious,
Mm.
but there's almost this shared collective memory that at a deeper level of psyche, we're all actually interconnected. There are aspects, structures, things, historical events, if you will, that happen throughout the entire life cycle, the history of the human race. And
Hmm.
when those events happen, they actually leave an imprint. These could be instincts that evolve, which then become more structured elements.
Hmm.
And that is literally your definition of the contents of the collective unconscious, i.e., the
Right.
archetypes of the collective
Hmm.
unconscious. And one way to begin to understand what Jung meant by the archetype is just to ask yourself what makes a human life typically human. What are
Hmm.
those core elements that, irrespective of culture, irrespective of difference, what are those elements that bind us together to make this life human? And for
Hmm.
me, one way to begin to understand that is to actually look at the key events throughout the life cycle that, irrespective of difference and culture, that we all celebrate. And
Hmm.
those are elements, if you will, of the human experience. Now, when you go through those elements, there could be typical figures that we might meet, experiences, typical experiences that we might have that could give rise to certain reactions on how we relate to that particular situation. So, in that sense, for Jung, it's also archetypal in the
Hmm.
sense that, yes, it is how we relate to the outer world, but equally, it's how we project what's inner onto the outer world. So
Right.
when we're looking at the archetypal, it's yes, it could be denoting the ways we're reacting in particular situations, but also internal conversations, internal developments that we're having that we so happen project that we project then onto the outer world. And
Hmm.
then those internal conversations get played out in how we interact with other people.
Yeah, that really reminds me of something that Dr. Rachel Moore, who's a film theorist at Goldsmiths, she talks about the reciprocity of film. And I suppose there's definitely a through line there that it is they are all kind of coming into our collective unconscious. And I suppose that's how you get from Nosferatu through to Jordan Peele's Us. Like they all kind of imprint on us as a
Yeah,
collective. And that's how
I
you kind of get to you get from point A to point B.
sure. So
Does that make sense?
I think what's potentially archetypal about Nosferatu is the image of the monster, the vampire, the werewolf, the zombie. And for me, it's really an indication of how neglected that part of the personality has become. And it's really a reflection of how grotesque the personality can become
Hmm.
if we don't allow it the light of consciousness, if we don't try to interact with it and to enter into that conversation and dialogue with that element of ourselves. So whenever we meet these fantastical creatures of the darkness, etc., we're meeting that completely undeveloped aspect of ourselves that needs to be known. And I dare say that the more we interact with these elements, the less dangerous they become.
Hmm.
But you can see then how dangerous Nosferatu and all those other monsters become
Hmm.
because we just haven't given it the light of day.
Yeah, they're untethered um in us as well. Yeah, with Nosferatu as well, there's he mentions like there's no one can escape his destiny, and it is like the destiny is for the two to become joined again.
Mm-hmm.
Um and obviously we know the kind of vampire trope of if they go into the light, they die. But apparently before that in Dracula,
Mm-hmm.
he just gets damaged by the light, but it was the first time F.W. Murnau decided that the monster dies in the light, which I think was a really interesting idea, especially given the kind of social context. It was made in
Mhm.
1922 in Germany, so that kind of beginning of the kind of Weimar era of cinema. That's super reflective on the culture and
Sure.
almost kind of looms heavy as a kind of premonition of what is to come.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the film from a psychological point of view, that ending, again, for me, it's not so much the dissipation and disappearance, but the relationship that now we then have to enter into with that darker element in ourselves. And
Mm,
what I found really interesting about Nosferatu, and this has been stated in so many different ways in so many other studies, is that shadow of sexuality, that shadow of desire,
mhm,
of the passions, the seduction as well. So the two scenes that really come to mind, it's she gets into this trance state almost,
mhm,
and she opens the window. She's inviting that element, perhaps that shadow element of repressed sexuality,
mhm,
into her life. And I think, remember, there were two really, poignant scenes where, as this trance state's happening, she clutches her breast. So then you can begin to make those associations with the breast, feeding, pleasure, sexuality, seduction, all encapsulated in the sexual pleasure that can
mm,
come with a bite. There's something about the blood, the redness, if you will. You were talking about alchemy
mhm,
earlier on, that kind of transformation and initiation into our sexual beings and our sexual
mhm.
bodies.
And at that point as well, what is more threatening than a young woman's sexuality and sexual awareness? That in itself was kind of threatening.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about Nosferatu as well, in contrast to kind of other vampire films, that he's quite sad, that
Mm-hmm.
um you kind of have empathy for him um within that, don't you think?
With Orlok, you mean, with Count
Yeah,
Orlok?
with Warlock, yeah.
That's really interesting. Can you say a bit more about that?
I think because he's so markedly different and he seems so desperate to taste
Sure.
they what he thinks they I should have thought this through. I'm just thinking off the top of my head what he thinks that they have.
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of want of the other, and he's so conspicuously the other to everybody else that there's something really sad about that.
Yeah.
And I suppose as the kind of decade goes on, in the 1920s Germany, it's the continuation of the haves and the have-nots, right? That goes absolute full circle with a bang in Parasite and Us.
Yeah.
Um,
I think, yeah, no, I think I understand more what you're getting at. Maybe there is that desire to understand what it means and tastes like to be human.
mm,
So if you are, the undead to a certain extent, living in, in these coffins, et cetera, et
yeah.
cetera, the very fact that he wants to buy a home in Bremen,
Mhm.
and then is situated across from this couple that he idealizes, perhaps there's a sense, if
Mm,
you will, of that unconscious element wanting and yearning to become human, to see the light of day, even if that moment of consciousness is momentary, fragmentary, fleeting.
yeah. Yearning to be human. That kind of brings us on to faces. But before we
Mm,
do, one thing that's really interests me about the shadow is kind of how almost unfashionable it is at the moment, At the moment, there's so much kind of positive psychology that the idea of kind of like looking at your own darkness and integrating it as opposed to squashing it is kind of like unfashionable in kind of our collective discourse about our own psychology, which I really like because that just pushes it into the dark even further.
yeah, yeah,
The kind of, I suppose, the kind of fashion is positive psychology, is kind of, um, you know, that everybody else is toxic, right? It's everybody else's fault. Whereas what the idea of the shadow does is that we all have it, and to be whole, we need to integrate it.
Yeah.
Super interesting. But you mentioned, sorry, did I interrupt you? Were you going to say something?
I just want to, to build on that. Absolutely agree. It's okay to be sad. We've medicalized what sadness actually means and what
Mhm.
the whole personality actually means. Um, for many, therapy is based on a trick. And I'll try to expand that a
Yeah,
bit
say more
more.
about that. Yeah.
So, most people who go into therapy go because something goes wrong. There's something that's just not right that propels them into therapy. It could be a symptom like, insomnia or anxiety, whatever it is. And then once you go into the therapy, what the therapist is actually doing is playing a trick that you've come in for this. You've come in to speak to that particular symptom. What
Mhm.
you don't know is we're actually going to look at everything else that's underpinning and supporting that particular symptom. That symptom is a manifestation of all this other stuff that we've left uncovered, the shadow
Mhm.
elements, things that
Mhm.
we've squashed into the closet. We pushed Beaumont, into the closet,
Yeah,
if you know.
yeah, yeah.
And that's actually the goal of analysis and therapy as well. Look, there are methods out there and forms of dare I say therapy. There are different options out there in terms of speaking to our mental health,
Uh-huh.
and some things are actually really helpful because yeah, sometimes it's just about thinking a bit differently about a particular situation and to get us back into the swing of life. That's absolutely, so there's a place for that, but
Mhm.
you can't stick a band-aid on something when the wound actually needs stitches and there's
Right.
something, and that you have to go deeper and speak to all that underlying stuff to really begin um, to heal, if you will,
Mhm. Mhm.
that initial wound.
Yeah, because also some of those kind of forms of therapeutic um of therapy, if you want to call it that, don't don't really acknowledge an unconscious. If you knew what was wrong with you, yeah, sure, sometimes you do and you just need some coaching, you struggle with presentations at work or what have you, and you can kind of get to the bottom of that. But um the whole idea of this is we don't know it, right? We don't know our shadow is unknown to us. We don't necessarily know our unconscious. And so it's as yeah, I guess yeah, a trick to kind of pull it all out
And if
into
we
the
don't
light.
know, yeah, if we don't know, sorry, Nikki, if we don't know, we're doomed to
Okay.
repeat. We're doomed to repeat. We then get
Yeah,
into kind of ways of being as if that's the only way of being, and
yeah,
not realizing that what it means to be human is that we can actually have a choice and step outside of that and say, you know what, enough of that. There's a
right.
different way to be. There's a different story I can tell about me and my past.
100. Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of that quote that I read out at the beginning, that which remains unknown will appear to us as fate. That's the thing that underlines it, We all think it's fated for us, but it's actually just us driving the car. It's just our unconscious. And yeah, as you say, we're doomed to repeat it. Um, so the next film that we're going to talk about, Faces by John Cassavetes, the wonderful John Cassavetes. I feel like he's really underrated in the UK. But he's super popular still in the US, and he's so influential on kind of especially independent American film of the last 50 years. The reason I really wanted to, so everything else has been kind of like darkness and monsters and but this is kind of like middle class people just going about their days. But I'm just going to read you something that he says about his characters. Um, that links into something that Jung says. Um, where is it? Okay, he says, my films are expressive of a culture that has had the possibility of attaining material fulfillment, whilst at the same time finding itself unable to accomplish the simple business of conducting human lives. We have been sold a bill of goods as a substitute for life, which is what you mentioned regarding Nosferatu. what is needed is reassurance in human emotions, a reevaluation of our emotional capacities. So it's super interesting because it's a real shift it, in focus because that's what a lot most of his films are about. It's just the kind of intricacies of people that should have everything, are super educated in the way they converse with each other. You can tell they're educated, or that they feel somehow that they have kind of language to be articulate, but um they just can't figure out how to be human. Like they're basically Nosferatu still. And it kind of links in with a quote from Jung, really similar to what we talked about, when he said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And I just thought
Mm-hmm.
that really like worked well together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was the film I was referring to when I sent Nick when I said Nikki sent me down the rabbit hole. And there's things to say. I mean, right off the bat, the title Faces is very interesting because
Mm.
instantly, with a Jungian lens on, one would think of the persona. So for
Hmm.
Jung, persona is the social mask that we wear and that we don, the various roles that we play throughout life.
Hmm.
And we wear these masks to survive, in essence. And it's also to preserve a sense of decorum as well. So for instance, I have multiple roles, right? As a lecturer, I try not to swear in front of my students. But in order to maintain that professionalism, to conduct myself a certain way, I put on the mask of the teacher, but
Hmm.
I can't be the teacher all the time. So I have different roles. So I'm a
Yeah.
father as well.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to lecture my kids all the time. So then there's another mask that I put on. So in that way, I realize that there are certain situations throughout life, you could say archetypal situations that we find ourselves in, that we just need to survive. Now, for Jung, it's the persona is natural. It's a natural element, natural reaction to the way we interact with the
Hmm.
world. The difficulty or the problems begin is that when we actually believe that one particular persona is everything that we are, as if it's our true selves and our identity. You
Right.
see that to a certain extent with this toxic masculinity, throughout Faces. So
Hmm.
we become confused, and then we think that the persona is actually our true self. So to bring in perhaps different films on the persona, the mask, it gets stuck, and
Yeah,
then we
yeah,
think
yeah.
it just becomes that aspect. What I found um, really challenging about Faces is that there's this link between the persona and the shadow, and I think that's what made for such uncomfortable watching for me, particularly.
Okay.
So one way to approach how psychological films can be is not necessarily in the interpretation of the characters, the narrative, the story arcs, etc. But, and this is something that Jung pioneered, is to actually look at our own reaction to the film itself and
Okay.
how uncomfortable it potentially makes us. Now, when things begin to get us out of our comfort zone, that we have an emotional response. I mean, we're not in the Marvel Cinematic Universe anymore, folks. This is
Definitely not.
um, what really felt uncomfortable to me, but then made me reflect on, wow, this is really holding a mirror up and showing me the shadow element, is that to look at that, to view that kind of toxic masculinity, that conversation, I believe, between Richard and Frank,
Hmm.
you know, about their old days, how they're treating Jeannie. It was really uncomfortable to watch until I
Hmm.
realized and take a pause and ask, well, what element is that about myself that it's potentially showing me? That's something in my own personality that I'm actually not really looking at. And one thing I found really challenging throughout is that we're always moving. I found myself trying to pinpoint these protean characters. They're so slippery. One moment they're happy, one moment they're sad, one moment they're aggressive, one moment they're
Yeah.
showing they're showing their vulnerability
Mhm.
and ability to relate and to connect. And that to me, it was this kind of constant flow. And it really showed that in terms of my face, my persona as an academic, I want to pinpoint, I want to hold down, I want to try to understand something. But this film wasn't allowing me to do that. We were in this kind of liminal space of constantly moving, moving,
Yeah.
moving.
Super uncomfortable, isn't it? So I mean, we can definitely talk about their the way they interchange so quickly and kind of shift like they're in an improv kind of situation. But what about the conversations between the two guys do you find so uncomfortable, if you don't mind sharing?
No, absolutely. I mean, the proposition of just asking Jeannie how much, even yes, in that particular time role, she's playing a sex worker. It
Mhm.
just seemed that in terms of our own kind of contemporary sensibilities, I can't help but take my current position located in the here and now, and
Mhm.
to see how masculinity is presented and femininity as well, that
Mhm.
we have these roles that he's almost holding up the mirror. Look, this is the way we're treating people. This is how we're pigeonholing people.
Mhm.
And look how, uh, for me at least, deplorable it actually is. And yes, this was the standard. But I think within that, there is that, what I would call that trickster element.
Okay.
Um, that, there's the subversion of power, there's different realms of power that people occupy. Um, but again, those moments of sensitivity are almost kind of washed away in an instant. So when you find that there might be something redemptive in a
Mhm.
particular character, in a particular interaction, like right at the last scene where they've seen Chet, I believe it is. He's run out. They're on the stairs, and even though they're so upset at each other, they're sharing a cigarette. They're passing each other a lighter, but
Mhm.
in the next moment, they pass each other, and it's all coldness, and
Mhm.
that's what we're left with. So there's
Mhm.
this sense of the oppositional nature of the human experience,
Mhm.
and how we are always, I wouldn't say necessarily in danger, but we have this proclivity to kind of move to those extremes.
Mhm.
And it really captures just how uncomfortable life is. Well,
Yeah,
not how it
how it can be. Yeah, because I think even though, it's 1968 and there are those kind of really marked differences of the time and era and space and the really specific way the group of men interact at Jeannie's, um, the way they're subtly eviscerating within a quite everyday context is the thing that kind of gets me. Is the thing that we have a version of that, the mumblecore kind of films do that and really take from Cassavetes, and that's more contemporary. But the phone conversation when he gets home and has that conversation with his wife, and it feels really strange because at once they're kind of playing with each other, aren't they? And kind of have that almost like feigned playfulness or feigned intimacy between them. And then they'll just cut each other down really quickly. And it's like they're trying on costumes of like, this is what intimacy is, this is what inflicting pain is, this is what um, you know, and especially the kind of the way Jeannie especially is like at the boys' table and kind of like singing with them, that I find so uncomfortable because there are elements of that I see every day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, which is absolutely shocking as well. And then again, just the relationship between Richard and Jeannie, that they share this moment, they share this connection. And in the morning he tells her, your eggs are horrible. I'm like, it's just these kind of
Yeah.
undercurrents of aggression, that again, it's almost on the brink of being a joke and really kind of harsh reality at the same
Hmm.
time.
Yeah, and that kind of like, and your eyelashes look ridiculous or something. That
Yes,
kind of
yes.
reminds me, like I don't know whether that's kind of like it reminds me of some scenes of French New Wave, and kind of later on, and I suppose this is the very, very, very beginning of like American New Wave. That kind of like dance between the jovial and the um cutting. It's like a hyper reality because I'm sure some people would say like it's kind of naturalistic, but it's like a imagined version of the realistic blown up,
Hmm. 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 Hmm.
which is really uncomfortable. And as you say, like there's kind of a mirror element
Hmm.
um that's really jarring, but both times I've seen it, I've kind of like watched it like that because it's so excruciating to watch,
Hmm. Hmm.
but
Yeah.
incredible.
It's one of those like, wow, I don't know if I could ever watch that again. But equally, I'm really grateful to you, but also just this fantastic series that you've put on to show a huge range of movies that touch or thematically are tied together with this aspect of the shadow. So it's been an absolute journey. I mean, I have this now. I won't get rid of it. It's there. It's in the library. And it'll definitely, I think, be a point of conversation and maybe some further study in the future.
Oh, awesome. I always love the idea of well, thank you for saying that, and always love the idea of converting someone to John Cassavetes, as painful as he can be sometimes. Um, so yeah, thank you ever so much for like speaking with me. It's been so much fun, just to kind of hear your thoughts. Um, yeah, on Jung and the shadow and how we watch films, and it just feels like there's like an infinite possibilities. Is there anything that you would suggest to the audience for us to kind of think about when we're watching these films, from
Mm.
a Jungian kind of perspective?
Yeah, so I think along the lines of what we're talking about in terms of faces and at least some possible reactions we could have for it. So I think um, Jungian ideas, theories, etc., they can be really helpful for us to pinpoint, let's say, certain characters, perhaps a certain role that they're playing, and maybe a psychological position or a counterpoint that they play in relation to all the other characters. And it's interesting. It's potentially very enriching to do that, but I think equally it's important not to just point out the archetype in the room, if you will, and that we have to look at the deeper layers and to see things as this kind of web of interconnectedness when we're trying
Hmm.
to understand and grapple with something. So
Hmm.
as you say, yes, there's the interpretation, but there's the personal element, the artist's intention, the authorial intention,
Hmm.
um, the societal, cultural, historical context, the potential commentary that's happening there, but also, and taking a page from therapy thinking, to look at our reaction to the film and look at what's potentially happening in that space when we are doing the viewing, if
Hmm.
you will, and what's the transaction that's happening, what's being elicited, what's being brought up to the surface, and to be
Hmm.
very mindful of that element as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and really like a really nice way to kind of watch our next film, whether it's part of this season, um, or the next time we go to the cinema with our friends, and kind of like using that as a framework to have a conversation afterwards. Is really exciting, really enjoyable. Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's such a pleasure to get to speak to a a Jungian. I feel like it's my favorite thing to do at the moment. It's like my thing of interest is like putting film with psychoanalysis. So it's always such a pleasure to get to speak to people that, know what they're talking about.
Absolutely. And thank you, Nikki. Great suggestions. I've learned a lot. I've really enjoyed our conversation as well.
Oh, awesome. Let's do it again sometime. For sure.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And for anyone coming to the season, tickets are now available. We're in the season. The next film is Parasite, and do pre-book tickets to Nosferatu because there'll be a live film score by the incredible Minima. So that's going to be immersive film screening. But yeah, thank you again and have a good evening.